It is a pleasure to be with you this morning, but for all that I feel honored, truly deeply touched by your invitation to speak today on the subject, Exodus, is God's redemption universal, I also feel intimidated approaching such a subject before such an audience of rabbis, each of whose members surely has a learned answer already in mind. Emotionally, I can only link this moment to the moment in July 1966, when I arrived in Israel from Rome, where I had been enrolled as a Jesuit in training at the Pontifical Gregorian University. Though I had unexpectedly made a few young Jewish friends in the last summer before I entered the Jesuits in 1960, straight out of high school, the short summary of my life, by the way, is that Jesuits made me an intellectual and the intellectuals made me an ex-Jesuit. So though I had made a few Jewish friends in 1960, the neighborhood segregation of 1950s Chicago meant that I had had no experience at all of the collective life of Chicago's Jewish minority. My claim as a result is that I made the acquaintance of the Jews first as the Israeli majority and only later came to know them as an American minority. I learned the holiday phrase, Nes Gadol Haya Po, before ever hearing Nes Gadol Haya Sham. There are differences between these two Jewish cultures, of course, but there are also similarities. One of the similarities is the commendable readiness of Jews, both there and here, to provide the needy with free advice. You know, of course, why Israelis never make love out on the street. It's not that they're so very inhibited, it's just all the advice. Israel has no national motto, I recently learned, no equivalent of a pluribus unum or in God we trust, but I'll tell you a secret. I have a suggestion, which I plan to convey to Benjamin Netanyahu through Barack Obama, that the Israeli national motto should be, hold on now, Ani Agid Lecha. And so this morning, as I prepared to reveal to you the deeper, less narrowly Jewish meaning of Shemot, I hear Ani Agid Lecha already springing to your lips. Fortunately for you, if not for me, I have reserved time for a generous Q&A period, or as it may turn out, an A&Q period. Where to begin? Let me begin in good Jesuit fashion by making a distinction, namely a distinction between Shemot and Haggadah Shel Pesach. Very roughly, the difference between these two texts is the difference between the story of Exodus as recalled in Eretz Yisrael and the story as recalled Bagolah. Within the country, the story is that of a great victory over Egypt recalled by those who are enjoying the fruit of the victory. From outside the country, it is the same story recalled by those who have suffered a great defeat, but who, rather than speak of it, choose instead to speak of the earlier victory and to hope someday to enjoy its fruits again. In Shemot, the great victory over Egypt is followed by other victories, beginning with the victory over Amalek, later taken as synecdoche for all the enemies of Israel, and climaxing with the victory over the tribes of Canaan. The implication of this string of victories is that God will always protect his covenanted people from their foes. In the Haggadah, by contrast, which came into existence under the long shadow of the Roman Churban, the enemy is not Rome alone, but rather the recurrent series of destroyers evoked in B'chol Dor Vador Amdu Aleinu L'chalotenu. Yet the Passover Seder is not a liturgy of lamentation, is it? Passover is not Tisha B'Av. The only destroyer named in the Haggadah is the one who failed so spectacularly, and the instruction to the participant in what seems a deliberate echo is B'chol Dor Vador Chayav Adam Lir'ot et Atzmo Ke'ilu Hu Yatsa Mitzrayim. Moreover, this early and pivotal interpretive aside in the Haggadah begins with the phrase V'hi she'amda. It is she who withstood. And what is the antecedent of that feminine pronoun? The same programmatic interruption in the narrative concludes Baruch hu matzilenu mi'adam. Blessed is he who saves us from their hand. Tacitly understood, or so I have assumed, and so it has evidently seemed to thousands of yeshiva students, is that God now guarantees Israel's survival through and only through Talmud Torah. The elusive antecedent of he in V'hi she'amda is thus Torah. Accordingly, O Israel, do not expect the Lord, be he ever so gadol v'norah, to rescue us ever again with Deuteronomy's mighty hand and outstretched arm. That's what I wrote, that last sentence. But this morning, as I reread it, it began to seem quite dubious to me. As I think of that long recitation toward the end of the Haggadah, of all the many victories that were won on the date of Passover, it almost began to seem like a kind of pep rally. It could be certainly read as a kind of call to arms for a Passover war. So I'm of a divided mind on that point. My first experience of a Passover Seder, as it happens, came in Israel in spring 1967. It was very easy on that occasion, with the anti-American Gamal Abdel Nasser ruling Egypt and Egyptian troops massing in Sinai along Israel's southern border, for me to identify with the Jewish side in what would become known as the 6 Days War. It would have been hard for me to ask the wicked son's question, Maha avodah hazot lechem. Why? Because as an American Christian, or so I supposed, I would be as bad off as any Jew in the event of an Egyptian victory. Israelis, by the way, could never remember that I was not a Jew, though they could never forget that I was an American. It's almost the reverse for a Christian in this country and there. Here, people never forget that you're a Christian, and they never think about the fact that you're also an American. Everybody's an American. There, sort of everybody's a Jew, but some are Americans. Amid the chaos of a defeat, I had no confidence in the ability or the will of the American consulate in Jerusalem to come to my rescue. If we are to believe revisionist historians, Israel's military planners knew by the end of the first day that their victory was assured. But I had no such confidence, and neither did many or most Israelis, not to speak of a good few of the young American Jews who were my classmates at the Hebrew University. And the emotional valence of that moment in my life is reactivated whenever I read a news report such as, to choose one example among all too many, the New York Times February 19th report of the mortal peril facing Yemen's few hundred remaining Jews, especially now that the last American forces have been evacuated. The slogan of the Houthi, the Shia sector of the Yemeni population now rampaging forward with Iranian support, is death to America, death to Israel, damnation to the Jews. The Times reporter Rod Nordland wrote that this slogan, quote, is chanted at all Houthi rallies, broadcast on television, and painted on what seems like every blank wall space in areas they control. A 36-year-old Jew whom Nordland interviewed said, "We have no friends, so we just try to stay away from everyone as much as we can." The risk to Yemen's remaining Jews, as Nordland describes it, seems little less than the risk of assassination on sight. True, the Sunni of Yemen, even of all Arabia, are now embattled against the Houthi, but the recent Sunni slaughter of 130 Houthi gathered to worship in a mosque can stand nonetheless as a fearful foretaste of what might await the Jews of Yemen, no matter who prevails, as well as, my further point, what might await the Jews of Israel in the event of a catastrophic defeat. B'chol dor vador. When I lived in Israel, I heard more than once the grim dictum, "We will only lose once." My own worst fear is not of a catastrophic single defeat, but rather of a significant, less than catastrophic, but deeply unsettling setback, followed by the silent but swift emigration from Israel of the highly educated, highly capitalized, internationally sophisticated, and mobile Ashkenazi minority, without whom the state will cease to be economically and militarily viable. Should a truly catastrophic military defeat then follow upon that exodus of the elite, it will engulf, above all, the Mizrahim, by then reduced to the status of a clear demographic minority vis-a-vis the Arabs of the land. The prospect of such a horror makes my blood run cold, for where will those Jewish refugees flee when the dark descends? To Europe? Some of you will have seen Jeffrey Goldberg's recent article, I think it was the April Atlantic, "Is it time for the Jews to leave Europe?" To America? But how many million Jews, fleeing in haste and panic as their country falls in defeat, can the United States reasonably be expected to rescue? I am speaking, I realize, in tones far from those that a liberal Christian might be expected to adopt when speaking to Jews about universal redemption. You arrived braced, I suspect, for a lecture on your responsibility as Jews for the welfare of Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. I will readily deliver such a lecture if you would like to invite me back on some future occasion. But today I am not speaking in any general way to Jews. I am speaking to rabbis in preparation for a distinct Jewish holiday. Rabbis who must speak to Jews in your congregations who experience the fears I just evoked far more vividly than they do those moral challenges. For all the swagger that I endured back in the late 1960s, from Israelis boastfully informing me that my country needed theirs more than theirs needed mine, I never for a moment doubted the blank terror that lived behind the swagger, and some of this seeped through even at that first Passover Seder of my life in 1967. I should say before going further that as, more than I realized at the time, a future serious student of comparative religion, I was struck from the very first moment by the sheer religious brilliance of the Seder, by the way it links old and young, food and music, learning and games, and past and present. There is really nothing quite like it in religious literature. The Seder remembers victory rather than defeat, joy rather than sorrow, the glory of God rather than the mystery of mankind. That passage where it's lacha, 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 aflacha, God, God, God. In this regard, it bears comparison with the Kaddish. As the soul cries out in grief, the mouth speaks praise. After my book, God, a Biography, won the Pulitzer Prize, I cut out an illumination from a facsimile edition of the Sarajevo Haggadah that I then owned, and gave it as a framed memento to Jonathan Siegel, my editor at Alfred A. Knopf. The phrase I framed from the Hallel was Lo lanu Adonai ki l'shimcha ten kavod. It is the noble and humble calling of a book editor, the dharma of the editor, I sometimes say, to stand back and give glory to the author as if the author were a little god. But in a few blessed moments, the two can stand side by side and give glory together to Hashem. I note that one of your breakout sessions is entitled The Seder as Jewish Education par excellence. I couldn't agree more than I do that it is indeed a superb vehicle for education, for it transmits not just knowledge, but also allegiance, not just information, but also initiation. Behind and around all of that, however, I was struck powerfully on my first acquaintance with the Seder by the fact that it was taking place in secret, as it were, underground, in the privacy and at least temporary safety of the Jewish home. The Goyim have their gargantuan basilicas, it seemed to say, and their stupendous public spectacles, but we have this, and this they can never take away from us. Yet beneath even that sense of family inwardness and shelter, like the diapason from a 32-foot organ pipe, almost too deep to be heard, there echoes the background awareness that the safety might be indeed probably will be temporary. It could all someday happen again. Indeed, it probably will. B'chol dor v'dor. The Seder initiates into that awareness as well, does it not? I do fully intend to speak of how the book of Exodus and the Passover Haggadah can be read as scriptures promising universal redemption, but no objective interpreter can deny that these texts are, in the first instance, about an intensely particular redemption. Yes, as we read in Exodus 12:38, Israel left Egypt as a mixed multitude, a mighty throng intermarried with Egyptians, accompanied almost certainly by their own Egyptian slaves. One may read into that ethnic variety the promise of redemption for others than the centrally redeemed Israelites, if one is determined to do so. But let us not forget that Numbers 10 blames the half-Israelites and non-Israelites wandering in the desert with Israel for complaining about the Lord's manna. Let us remember that in Leviticus 24, a half-Israelite whose father is Egyptian blasphemes the name of the Lord and is stoned to death at the behest of Moses. To say the very least, Exodus does not linger over the question of how or from just what these or any other non-Israelites or semi-Israelites are to be redeemed. And the Haggadah at most addresses such a question only glancingly. To complicate the task further, the narrative trajectory of the Israelite epic that begins with the creation of mankind and ends with the Babylonian exile arcs away from the universal and toward the particular rather than vice versa. The focus narrows from the world to the garden in Genesis 2 and from the human race to the tribe of Abraham in Genesis 12. God's conditional covenant through Moses with Israel in the book of Exodus narrows to his unconditional covenant with David in the book of Samuel and the narrowing of the monarchy to dynasty thereafter. If our concern is with biblical resources for Jewish universalism, it would seem that we must look not to Exodus, but rather to the literature emerging just after the crushing defeat of the national dynasty. We should turn, in other words, to the latter prophets, above all to Isaiah, and within Isaiah to Deutero-Isaiah. It is in those works that Israel begins to address what we might call its Gentile problem, as the implicit henotheism of the Hexateuch and the former prophets gives way to mature, self-conscious monotheism, and as the implications of that monotheism begin to be confronted. If there is not one tutelary God per nation, as was the common Semitic view, but rather a sole God watching over all nations, then must all nations not somehow be as one in their relationship to that one God? And by way of corollary, if different relationships are to be postulated, what are they to be? Rabbinic Judaism would develop answers to such questions: the Adamic covenant, the Noachic covenant, and other accommodations for the righteous among the Gentiles. But it is in the aftermath of the Babylonian Churban that these questions first began to force themselves on what, from that point on, can fairly be called the Jewish mind. Here, of course, a Christian must tread carefully. For Christian exegesis of the Jewish scriptures has singled out and celebrated the prophetic texts in which this universalism resounds, as if these few texts expressed the sole and final message of Jewish revelation. In truth, they do much less than that. My thinking on this matter was decisively marked back as far as the 1970s by an essay contributed by the general editor of the Jewish publication society Tanakh, the late Harry Orlinsky, to a festschrift for Herbert Gordon. Orlinsky's essay was entitled National Universalism and Internationalism in Ancient Israel. In it, he faulted Christian exegetes for exaggerating the importance of late, relatively marginal, but for Christian purposes and perhaps simply for liberal purposes, appealingly universalistic texts like the book of Jonah and the book of Ruth, not to speak of the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, all this to the neglect of much more numerous, however inconveniently nationalistic or militaristic texts like the book of Joshua and indeed like the book of Exodus. Going further, Orlinsky argued that properly understood, even Deutero-Isaiah offers a vision of universal harmony in which the essential first step for the nations is to acknowledge God and Israel in their eternal, unbreakable, exalted, and exalting covenant. That covenant, once recognized, the nations, yes, may stream to Zion to study Torah, but they must be prepared to serve Israel as well as God in the covenant partnership that joins them. Absent some such readiness, the invitation is effectively rescinded. John D. Levinson, a now senior scholar from the generation that succeeded Orlinsky's, has, like Orlinsky, been concerned over the years with how Jewish and Christian exegesis differ when reading texts that both communions honor. However, Levinson has more recently been at pains to elucidate how these schools of exegesis are sometimes alike in ways that may have been overlooked. Christianity substituted its heavenly Jerusalem for the earthly Jerusalem, eternal life in heaven for terrestrial redemption in the promised land. Over the centuries, most Jewish exegetes have eschewed any such spiritualization of God's promises to Israel as inherently un-Jewish, but in his Resurrection and the Restoration of Israel, the ultimate victory of the God of life, Levinson offers a carefully pondered qualification. Immortality, as the reward for fidelity to the Lord, is neither a Christian invention, he argues, nor the Hellenistic adulteration of a Semitic worldview. Resurrection as God's reward for fidelity to God's covenant is a concept authentically Jewish in origin. It would seem to me to follow from this that if bondage in Egypt is made a metaphor for mortality, then redemption from Egypt can indeed be made a metaphor for resurrection. And in this adjusted form, redemption can perhaps be extended to those who do not belong by birth or even by conversion to God's unique covenant with Israel. I offer a coarse and perhaps distorting summary, but I do see in Levinson's work a closely reasoned thrust toward an authentically Jewish, yet universally relevant interpretation of the Exodus tradition. In other words, we are all as one at the creation of the world as we emerge from God, and are we not then all as one after death as we return to God? Perhaps our differences are different themselves at that point. In any case, is it not somehow incumbent on those who pray every year, Hashana haba Abirushalayim, but then do not actually go to Jerusalem, to acknowledge that one way or another they must be endowing that famous line with some semblance of an other than literal meaning? If I may recall another personal aside, I recall combatively and rather rudely challenging a Jewish friend in New York in the late 70s to stop saying Hashana Haba'ah and so forth if she had no intention of making Aliyah. If she was unwilling to emigrate, I said, then the Passover Seder had no meaning for her and she should cease celebrating it. Put up or shut up. She countered that it was passing strange to hear so literalistic an interpretation of the Haggadah from someone who attended a weekly religious service in which the solemn central line was, "This is my body." Taking her point, then I make her point to you now. And it seems that the Lord has played a little joke on me. I'm on page 13 of my paper, which is about 20 pages long. So I'm going to have to remember the rest. So I came to this point and saw that yes, some kind of metaphorical interpretation might be possible. But I then said to myself, well, this all sounds rather, high-minded or the Oambah academic, and aren't there some other ways to universalize the meaning of Exodus and the meaning of the Passover Haggadah than by leaping to the question of the afterlife? And, of course, one can talk about social justice. One way or another, the political option is the one that cries out for activation, you might say. Let my people go was the way that black slaves took the Exodus story and employed it as a vehicle to inspirit themselves in their own very long, slow, and painful journey toward the promised land of freedom and equality in the United States. And we can point to other subject peoples around the world who might use the text of the liberation of this one subject people as a tale of inspiration. But then I turned away from that, you might say, more flat-footed political option to the case of actual continuing slavery around the world. And I did a little research on slavery in our time and found my way to a website called freetheslaves.com. And here you learn that there are 21 to 36 million actual slaves around the world today. 78% of them are labor slaves doing mostly heavy lifting or else very menial tasks, like garbage collection and maid service and that kind of work that might fall more to the women than to the men. Fully 22% are sex slaves, and the horrendous picture that we've had lately of Yazidi women and Christian women being abducted and turned into sex slaves in Iraq is really just the tip of a very large iceberg. By no means is this practice confined to the Muslim world. I think something like a fifth of all those who are enslaved around the world are under the age of 18. Of exploring freetheslaves.com further, one discovers that modules in which anti-slavery activists from different religious traditions offer grounds for resistance to world slavery from their own texts. And of these modules, by far the most impressive is the Jewish one. It's put together by two women, both rabbis. I can't recall their names, but if you go there, you will find that they have placed their module on the site just recently and quite consciously in preparation for Passover 2015. So they are inviting you to invite your congregations at this time of a celebration of liberation in the life of Israel to consider other enslaved people around the world and put up or shut up in that way, even if you don't go to Jerusalem next year. I ended my draft. This reminds me, I've had this happen to me just once before. And on that occasion at the University of Utah, I opened my folder and there was nothing in it. So I had to ad-lib the entire speech. I think this may be on the bio sheet about me. My most recent work, which was 8 years in gestation, is the Norton Anthology of World Religions. The Norton Anthology was published in November 2014 in two hardcover volumes of more than 2,000 pages each, a boxed set. It has just been published in a 6-volume paperback edition, so you can now buy David Beale's paperback anthology of Judaism for $45, I believe. And if you're teaching a course, you can probably get it for less than that. This is 700 pages, and it goes from, I think, one pre-biblical text, something from the Enuma Elish, down to the last text is actually by Philip Roth. It is the peroration, as I call it, from Roth's novel *The Counterlife*, in which Zuckerman is considering whether to have the child now being carried by his lover Maria, not a Jew, circumcised or not. They know that it is a boy. Will he have the boy circumcised? Well, this is, as David said when we had a public program at the 92nd Street Y in New York with Susanna Heschel with us. He said it wasn't as if absolutely anything from Roth would qualify for inclusion. But this was a passage in which he was considering the state of his alter ego, Zuckerman's Jewish identity, and also considering the question of what his commitment, if any, was to continuing that identification into a second generation, with circumcision being the vehicle for the continuation. David takes the view in his opening lines of his general introduction that Judaism is anthologistic in principle. The Bible is an anthology. Subsequent Jewish scriptures build further layers around it and penetrate within it midrashically and strike sparks from the rock without cease for all time. So that's approximately where I ended. I was in touch with Susan Freudenheim from the Jewish Journal, who asked me if I would like to write something for them. I said I was going to give this talk, and maybe they could derive some little article from it. She told me that they couldn't. And I said, you made the right decision. I've been an editor myself, and I don't think I would have found it suitable. But they also have a website where they post links to things that they don't publish in the print journal. So I guess they're going to publish a link to it, and if you want to read the portion that I had to reconstruct from memory, you can just check your copy of the Jewish Journal. Thank you for your attention. And Jonathan, do we have any time, or do you want to go to your breakout sessions?
Time, if you would like to.
Okay. Okay. What's on your mind? Hi.
So, what's your answer to the question posed in the title?
Oh yes. Okay. So what I said was in my final lines that the potential for a universal interpretation is there. The potential for a nationalistic, I have to watch which finger I lift up, a nationalistic interpretation is also there. These are in tension, but they are in an undeniable tension with each other. And you, as rabbis, have to resolve that tension. And you can take it in as nationalistic or as universalistic a direction as you want. Broadly speaking, the secular option for taking it in a universalistic direction is liberation and a political direction. The more religious way of taking it would be to think in terms of the afterlife. I also do have, I skipped over this, I have a whole little riff that includes a quotation from the current Scientific American about how the discussion of the afterlife is no longer quite as unmentionable as it once was. Even very educated people are asking questions on that subject. Since death is nothing other than the deprivation of life, if you take a material definition of life, you don't understand what life is until you understand what matter is, which involves understanding what antimatter is, which involves understanding what energy is, which involves understanding what dark energy is. And that carries you back to the Big Bang, which carries you to the possibility of multiple universes where other physical laws may obtain, and now you're back to the deathbed, where what's really happening you don't know. So in that mystery, there's a certain kind of possibility. But that was a digression. Yeah.
How does Shavuot, 7 weeks after Passover, play into the economy between physical liberation?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
So how does Shavuot, which occurs 7 weeks after Passover, fit into the dichotomy, that binary between physical liberation and afterlife?
I think you have an answer in mind to that question. What is your answer?
Well, I do, but pose it to you. I think there's another dimension.
I don't have an answer.
Jack, could you go back?
So the question is, Shavuot, 50 days after Passover, we have Shavuot. And how does it connect? What is its connection with liberation? And I don't really have an answer at the tip of my tongue, and I think the questioner has something in mind. So I asked him to say what it was.
Well, without making this dialogue, I think there's...
That's okay. Make it a dialogue.
I will pursue this other than saying that I think outside of physical liberation and afterlife, there are yet multiple other dimensions, not least of which is certain
Spiritual liberation. You know, I did actually include reference to a photography book for which I wrote the introduction. It's called Golden States of Grace, and it's called Prayers. The subtitle is Prayers for the Disinherited. And one of these has photograph. One of the sections deals with photographs of a Passover Seder being celebrated at, is it called Beit Shuvah? It's a 170-bed facility in Culver City for recovering addicts. I don't think it's only for Jews, but that there are Jews there who learn Torah while going through a 12-step program. So for them, slavery is addiction, and recovery is liberation. That's another spiritual kind of liberation. Laura.
What would you say to your congregation if you were us about so much
Okay.
or after a race?
If I were a rabbi,
Or just how does that anger and rage fit into this conversation?
anger and rage, which,
At the end of, when you open the door, provide you
Oh.
the section where
Right.
you ask God to pour out your wrath on
Right.
everybody that ever hurt us.
that's the hard one, isn't it? I mean, I used to pass this temple when I worked at UCLA, and I would glance up at the wall, and I think what the wall has carved on the outside, maybe you can tell me, is it Lador Vador?
Yes.
Lador Vador. So that just refers to the transmission of the tradition from generation to generation. But in my mind, driving by, just glancing up, I saw it as saying Holdor Vador. And all I could think of was generations of persecution. And that the temple, in my mind, began to seem a kind of monument to the Holocaust. We're still here despite that. So I made a mistake. David, you want to say something? Well, but to Laura's question, I mean, it is the point where you have to say, we are as capable of oppression as those whose oppression we are denouncing. Recognize that human capacity to abuse the weak is universal.
Although I saw a comment by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs in response to this, where he argues that Judaism says that vengeance is in God's hands, not in our hands. The same thing is true in the Purim story, and that religions that speak about a non-violent God, very often the practitioners of the religion are the violent ones. Whereas at least as he understands Judaism, our God is violent, and therefore we leave vengeance to God.
Well, that's also actually a line that's in the New Testament: "Judge not, that you be not judged," and leave all matters to be resolved after Elijah comes. I mean, that's how you come up with a good way to address that difficult issue by telling your congregants they have offended, but it is God who will bring judgment upon them, not we. I would stand by my first point, though, that we are all capable of such offenses, and even that moment could be an appropriate one to recall our common capacity for wrongdoing. Yeah.
I think there is a difference, a generational difference in how
young people are looking at the situation in Israel, the Palestinians, as compared to perhaps my generation and older. How would you address young people through the Seder in thinking about the sort of triumphalism that's in the Seder, and the question that is in the uppermost in their minds as they're struggling to sort of be Jewish on college campuses, for example, and the Seder coming up and what's happening in Israel?
Well, so the question is, there's a difference between the younger generation and the older generation. The older generation are more comfortable with a nationalist interpretation. The younger generation are drawn to a universalistic interpretation. And what is the rabbi to do, caught in the middle? I began my remarks talking about the Jews of Yemen to underscore the legitimacy of fear. And I jumped from Yemen to Israel, big jump, right? To underscore the legitimacy of fear even for the security of Israel. So the younger people who live in the security of the United States do not easily appreciate the terror that lingers in the back of the minds of older people. That's the challenge to them. The older people have to recognize that the sense of responsibility that the younger feel, very much in the spirit of Judaism's devotion to justice toward the Palestinians, is also legitimate, and that the Palestinians also have the right to live, in their own country, secure within their own borders, not having to fear judicial execution from the air, or invasion at any moment, or the confiscation of their national revenue when it is convenient for another government to confiscate it. Things of that sort. David?
I'm seized a little bit on the idea of meaning. So I want to start with, first of all, Pesach and Shavuot introduced Isaiah forbids freedom from and freedom to. That's what Shavuot is. It's freedom to receive the Torah. Passover is freedom from slavery. And on death, that same Atlantic that had Jeffrey Goldberg's article had an article about NDE's near-death experiences. We talked about afterlife being legitimate. We talked about it in the New York Group, which had a two-part essay on NDEs also. So it is coming into the mainstream discussion. Okay. What I wanted to ask, though, was the fear of universalism from particulars is that there's nothing Jewish, specifically Jewish, about universal values. And Jews, and in universalism, Judaism itself can dissolve. So the most particularistic Jews are the ones that tend to best survive. The more universalistic they are, the more they tend to disappear. So if you're a rabbi, how do you balance it so that you don't vanish and there are no Jews left to be universalists?
Universalism can tend, the question is what survives of that is really Jewish once you take the leap toward universalism. And I think it's true that universalism tends toward homogenization, but it doesn't have to do that automatically. It is possible for there to be an understood equality among peoples, while each people retains a great many usages that are particular to them. And conservative Judaism wasn't abandoning any of the 19th century humane values of Reform Judaism when it began to reintroduce more Hebrew into the liturgy. That might be seen to have introduced a kind of barrier between the Jews whose religious services were not ones that any Protestant could walk into and feel completely at home. Now they began to seem foreign. So what? Let them seem a little bit foreign. Nobody gets hurt by that. Dietary restrictions are the same way. If I eat shrimp and you don't, and you say it's my religion, it's incumbent on me in my full flush of universalism to say, fine. He doesn't, I do. As long as he can say, fine, you do, I don't. So I think it takes some work to to prevent universalism from dissolving into homogenization. It is a real danger, so I acknowledge the peril, but I think it can be possible. I recall talking to a Protestant scholar, Bible scholar in the Netherlands, about the collapse of Catholicism in the Netherlands since the Second Vatican Council. He thought it was really foolish for the Catholics to have given up religious habits for nuns, fish on Friday, fasting before Holy Communion, public processions carrying the Eucharist in a golden monstrance. All these bits of pageantry had made the Catholics seem different, and yet there was a lot of response to all that on the part of young people. Instead, they did not modernize in any of the things that really people cared about, such as divorce, ordination of women to the clergy, artificial birth control. All of those things were maintained in complete rigidity. Meanwhile, they tossed out all those usages that made Catholics seem communitarian, provided a communitarian unity to them. So I think there's a way to keep some of those usages while still retaining others. Yeah.
In the middle of your presentation was very entertaining and fun to hear that dialogue between you and a woman friend. And she says, next to her, Jerusalem. And you said, really? And she says,
This is my body.
My
Right?
body. And she said, really? And I'm struck by another important line which you referred to several times. It's the rest of the whole of our door, where the key word seems to be which seems to be a significant distinction.
Okay.
Certainly between
Yeah.
religious traditions and particularly here, and you've spoken about it before, so I don't want it to be repetitive necessarily, but I'm wondering, how do you treat that word? And how does that help us, perhaps, in our expectation of this particular model?
Well, Kahilu is the kind of gateway to taking something like drug addiction and making that your Mitzrayim. Then you yatsabi that, and into. So it is an invitation, isn't it? I mean, to legitimize various metaphorical or transferred applications of the story. You take it as a kind of master story. I also, it's probably better that I forgot my speech because you get more time to talk, but I don't know whether anybody here knows a woman named Ruth Broidy Sharon. Anybody here know Ruth? This is a woman who took a mixed group of black and white people led by herself and a black woman whose conversion to Judaism she had mediated to Egypt. And they celebrated interracial unity in view of the Nile River. That was a rather quixotic gesture, I thought, on Ruth's part. But she surpassed it by a wide margin when she decided to arrange a Seder celebrating the liberation of Egypt after the Arab Spring. And to this, she rented a hall in Westwood, and to this Seder she invited the Egyptian consul, who felt he couldn't decline the invitation, though he was undoubtedly a Mubarak appointee. And she invited the Los Angeles consul from Israel, who also couldn't say no, though he shared all the misgivings that official Israel shared about what the Arab Spring was going to lead to. And as for the rest of the people who showed up, including yours truly, I mean, we were quite a mixed multitude. And it was poignant, it was touching, it was beautiful, it was hilarious. It all kind of petered out. We ran out of time. People had to leave. We ended at a slide of. But she believes in her heart that Seder can be a liturgy of universal liberation. She keeps trying to use it that way for Jews, sometimes for non-Jews as well. Yeah.
I was at that Seder.
Were you there?
The question I have is, we're living in an interesting time in that more and more Christians are celebrating Passover.
Yeah, a little bit clumsily, but yeah.
Right. But they're still taking it as theirs. And you go to the Kotel now and you see more and more Christians with the quote,
to me, the Seder belongs to the Jews. And I want a Jew to be in charge of any Seder I go to. I mean, I don't mind a kind of staged educational exercise taking place in a church so that people can know how it's done, on the full understanding that we're not actually doing it. But I don't like the thought that it's a garment off the rack that anybody can take and wear. But I don't think so. That's just my emotional gut feeling on the matter. I think it has to be more Jewish than that to work.
You mentioned a lot of the current regional realities. Today seems to be kind of a good day in the region. I wonder if you had any comments on the current talks that we're with Iran.
The current talks with Iraq? Oh, with Iran. Well, I stayed in a hotel last night, and this morning I pulled out of the parking place where I had arranged overnight parking. I'd had breakfast, I still had some time to kill, so I pulled into a metered parking place and just turned on the radio and was listening. And who should I come across discussing this subject but George Mitchell, who of course led very interesting, completely failed attempt to bring about reconciliation between Jews and Arabs in Palestine and Israel. And they were asking him various questions and quoting Netanyahu to him and quoting Samantha Powers to him and quoting John Boehner to him, in each case the most provocative comments. And also asking him what he thought about the Iran negotiation. He hadn't anything really deeply informative to say about the Iran negotiation. But after several of these questions, he sort of grabbed the mic, you might say, and said that what really had to be talked about is what he had taken away from his earlier years was a total lack of trust on the two sides. The Palestinians, and this includes Abbas personally, do not believe that Netanyahu or anyone ever in power in Israel has ever sincerely wished there to be two states. And when he recently said that he didn't intend to ever bring that about, was no surprise to them. Well, he said it out loud, now it's slipped out, but we always knew it. That's the way they distrust the Jewish side. And the Jewish distrust of the Palestinian side is that they do not wish Israel ever to be at peace, to ever be secure. There should always be maintained some degree of threat, some degree of danger, some ongoing refusal of what has been brought into existence there. Well, it's easy to name that lack of trust as the core problem. And that's about the time I had to turn the radio off. He didn't seem, however, likely to pull a rabbit out of his hat and say, here's how we build trust. He does stick with the standard American position, however, which has, and I think pretty much continues to be, that the two sides should resolve their differences in direct negotiations. This means for him that the United States should continue its opposition to the establishment of a Palestinian state via a Security Council resolution. Although, as I listened to him, I thought, well, when Israel declared its independence, it did so unilaterally. So have the Palestinians. I guess the Palestinians have already unilaterally declared their independence a couple times. But the question is, will it be followed as Israel's declaration of independence was by some international recognition? To me, that would seem to be a kind of leveling of the playing field. You would have then two recognized political entities, both resident in one form or another on the land, with no border drawn yet between them. So Israel at the moment has no border, has no land border, it has the ocean. It doesn't have a land border. It needs a land border. It has to be agreed upon. If the Iranian matter is in the way, then if your priority is to get peace in Israel, I suppose you might sacrifice that to it. My fear is that if the deal collapses, Europeans take a walk, and Iran then just has a completely free hand. So this seems to be what's happening now, seems to at least retain some degree of leverage. But it's, I shouldn't even say that much. I don't really know what to do.